The food slot opened and slid 3 gray cubes across the floor before I could even lift my head. That was how every morning started aboard whatever this ship was. No greeting, no explanation. Just 3 gray cubes hitting metal and the slot snapping shut again like a mouth that had already said too much. I picked one up and turned it over. It smelled like nothing. It tasted like damp cardboard pressed into the shape of something that had once, a very long time ago, been near food. I ate anyway. Behind me, 11 other kids were waking up on the floor, blinking at the pale blue light that hummed from the ceiling at all hours. There were no windows. There was no night. My name is Owen. I was 16 years old when the light came down over the radio telescope field outside Dunmore. I'm 23 now, sitting at a desk that overlooks a city that looks more or less like the one I grew up in, except that sometimes the sky has ships in it that are not from here, and nobody thinks it is strange anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The field trip had been Mrs. Gallagher's idea. She taught physics at our school, and she had been trying for 3 years to get permission to take us to the Dunmore Array, which was a collection of 15 large radio dishes sitting in a valley about 40 miles from town. The dishes were old. The facility was understaffed. But Mrs. Gallagher believed in it the way she believed in everything she loved, which was quietly and with a great deal of stubbornness. There were 14 of us that day, 12 students and 2 teachers. We had packed lunches and were annoyed about the bus seats and were arguing about something that I cannot even remember now when the sky turned white. Not the clouds, the sky itself. The whole blue dome of it went white all at once, like someone had replaced it with paper, and then there was a sound that was not really a sound, but more like the feeling of a sound, something very low and very wide. And then I was somewhere else. The cell was roughly 8 meters long and 4 meters wide. The floor was a dark metal alloy that vibrated faintly at all times, like the whole ship was purring. The walls were smooth and gave off that constant pale blue glow. There were no visible seams or hinges in the walls except for the food slot, which was near the floor on the left side, and a small grill near the ceiling that circulated air. There was one door. It had no handle on our side. When I woke up in that room, there were 11 other kids with me. Mrs. Gallagher and the other teacher, Mr. Holt, were not there. I do not know to this day what happened to them in those first hours. I found out later, much later, that they had been placed in a separate holding area because the beings who took us had classified the adults and the children as separate units without understanding why the children were with adults in the first place. The youngest among us was Lily. She was 11. She had red hair and was wearing a yellow raincoat because it had been threatening to rain that morning. She sat against the far wall with her knees up and her arms wrapped around them, and she did not cry. That surprised me. I had been expecting someone to cry, and I kept waiting for it, and it never came from her. What came instead was a question. She looked at me and said, "Do you think they speak English?" I said I did not know. She said, "We should probably figure that out." That was the moment I understood that we were going to be all right. I did not know how or when or in what condition, but something settled in my chest when she said that. This was a problem. Problems could be worked on. There were 12 of us in total. Lily was the youngest at 11. I was the oldest at 16. In between were Kara, who was 12 and obsessed with marine biology. There was Finn, also 12, who barely spoke, but who I would later discover had an extraordinary memory for patterns. There was Nina, 13, who had been in the middle of telling a joke when the light came, and who finished the joke the moment she woke up in the cell, as if she refused to let anything interrupt her. There was George, 13, who had a bleeding cut on his palm from where he had fallen, and who wrapped it carefully in a strip torn from his jacket without being asked. There was Priya, 14, who immediately began counting the floor tiles. There was Darius, 14, who had been carrying a pack of cards in his back pocket and who spent the first hour doing card tricks to anyone who would watch. There was Cleo, 15, who kept a small notebook in her coat pocket and started writing in it within 20 minutes. There was Ben, 15, who had strong opinions about everything and was very loud about them, and who I found genuinely comforting because he made the room sound normal. There was Abby, 15, who sat beside Lily from the beginning and did not leave her side for the entire duration. And there was me, I did not appoint myself leader. It happened the way things like that always happen, which is that someone has to and no one else does, and then it is done. We had been in the cell for what I estimated to be about 6 hours when the door opened for the first time. The being that came in was tall, very tall. It moved on 4 lower limbs and had 2 additional upper limbs that it held slightly away from its body, the way a person might hold their arms when their hands are wet. Its body was largely translucent, the kind of pale that is almost white, and inside it you could see darker structures moving slowly, which I later understood were its organs circulating fluid. Its head was roughly triangular, wide at the top and narrow at the jaw, and it had no eyes that I could identify, but it had a ring of small dark patches around the widest part of its head that I suspected served a similar function. It stood in the doorway for a moment. It appeared to be looking at us. Then it spoke. The sound it made was layered, like several tones happening at the same time. It was not unpleasant, but it was completely meaningless to me. Then, after a pause, a second voice came from a small rectangular device it held in one of its upper limbs, and that voice was flat and mechanical and spoke in English. It said, "Designate your commanding unit." Nobody moved. I stood up. I said, "I am the oldest. My name is Owen. Who are you?" The being turned its head slightly. It said something in its layered tones. The device translated. "You are the leader of this scout unit?" I said, "We are not a scout unit. We are students. We were on a school trip." The device paused longer than usual before translating. I got the impression the delay was not technical. I got the impression the concept it was trying to convert did not have a direct equivalent. The being said, "Clarify the term school." I said, "A place where young people go to learn things." Another long pause. The being said, "Young?" I said, "Yes. We are children. We are not adults. We are not soldiers. We are not scouts. We are young people who were taken for a field trip and we would like to go home." The being stood very still. Then it said something that the device did not immediately translate. It said it again. The device finally produced, "This claim requires verification." Then it left. The door closed. Ben said, behind me, "That went well." Nina laughed. It was not a comfortable laugh, but it was real, and it moved around the room, and by the end of it, we were all a little less afraid. In the days that followed, the being, which I came to think of as the interrogator, returned regularly. It asked questions about Earth. It asked about our government, our military structures, our energy systems, our communication networks. I answered every question with either something harmless and true or with a question of my own. It seemed genuinely unprepared for the questions. It would stand very still when I asked them, like a machine that had received an input it did not have a category for. On the 4th day, it asked me how old I was. I told it 16 years. It stood still for a very long time. It said, "Of your species' total lifespan, what proportion does 16 years represent?" I said, "We usually live to be about 75 or 80, some longer." It said, "Then you are approximately 20% complete." I said, "I suppose so." Yes. The silence that followed that exchange was the longest one yet. The interrogator did not move. Its organs, which I could faintly see cycling inside its translucent body, seemed to slow. Then it turned and left without another word. And I heard something I would not have a name for until much later, a tone from somewhere outside the cell, low and rapid and cascading, that I eventually learned was an emergency summons. That evening, Priya finished counting the tiles. She told me there were 216 of them, and that they were arranged in a pattern that repeated every 9 tiles. I wrote the number down in Cleo's notebook. I do not know why. It felt important to record things. It felt important to know what we were standing on. Lily asked me if I thought we were going to get out. I said yes. She said how. I said, "I have no idea yet. But there are 12 of us, and only one of them at a time, and we are already making them confused, which I think is a good start." She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded and picked up one of the gray cubes and started eating it like the conversation was settled. Maybe it was. The second time the interrogator came, I was ready for it. I had spent 2 hours after the first visit thinking about what it had asked and what it had not asked and what the gap between those two things told me. It had asked about military capacity. It had asked about government structure. It had not asked about population, about geography, about resource distribution, about any of the things you would ask if you were trying to understand a species rather than assess a threat. That told me something. It told me they were afraid of us in some abstract way, or at least cautious of us, which meant they believed we were more significant than 12 people in a cell suggested. I decided to use that. When it came back, it asked again about our communication technology. I answered, slowly and with some apparent consideration. The human communication technology was advanced enough to have been broadcasting signals into space for nearly 100 years. This was true and entirely unhelpful to anyone trying to assess our military capacity, but it was the kind of thing that sounded important without being important. It stood very still for a moment. Then it asked what the range of our signals was. I said, "Far enough that you found us." I do not know where that came from. It just came. It was not a threat, and it was not information, and it was not really anything at all except the kind of answer you give when you're tired and 16, and you have been in a metal room for 4 days, and you're trying to project a calm that you mostly feel, but not entirely. The interrogator stood still for a long time after that. Then it left without another question. I turned around. Most of the others were awake and watching. Darius raised his eyebrows. I shrugged. Ben said, very quietly, "Nice." On the 5th day, the food slot produced something slightly different. The cubes were the same, but there was also a small quantity of a liquid in a sealed container that turned out, after careful investigation by Kara, who had some understanding of chemistry, to be water. Clean, plain, ordinary water. We had been drinking a faintly mineral liquid from a dispenser in the wall that was not unpleasant, but was clearly not water. This was water. Nobody said anything significant about it. We drank it. But I noted it in my mental log because it was a change, and changes in a static environment means something. Someone had made a decision. Someone had decided we should have water. I thought about the interrogator standing still after my answer. I thought about the 7 incident reports the monitoring technician was filing. I thought about the guard who had twice now paused at the slot before pushing the cubes through, that small delay, that moment of something that might have been curiosity or might have been nothing. I thought, we are being watched more carefully than they are letting on. That night, in the dim quiet, I went through everything I knew and organized it into things that were certain, things that were probable, and things that were possible. Under certain. We were alive and had been kept that way deliberately, which meant we had some value to them. Under probable. The interrogator's questions were not producing the information it expected, which was causing some kind of reassessment. Under possible. There were beings somewhere in this system or beyond it who either knew where we were or were looking, because the kind of monitoring network that had scanned us on arrival did not exist in isolation. Under possible, with a low confidence, we were going to be all right. I moved it to probable before I went to sleep, outside the walls of our cell. I could not have known what was already moving. I could not have known that the scan taken of us on our first day had been automatically logged to a monitoring network that crossed dozens of star systems. I could not have known that somewhere far away, a machine had looked at our biometric data and sent a flag marked urgent to a desk belonging to someone who would change everything. I was 16, and I was sitting on a humming metal floor, and I was eating gray cubes and counting days. That was all I knew how to do. It turned out that was enough. The monitoring station that first flagged our data was not manned in the way that human stations are manned. It did not have a crew walking corridors or drinking hot beverages in a break room. It was closer to a very large, very old machine that hummed in orbit above a small, uninhabited planet and listened to the traffic of 1,000 different transponders across a wide sector of space. Its job was to notice things. It noticed things constantly and with very little drama. The way a lighthouse does not care about the ships it saves, it simply keeps turning. On the 5th standard rotation after our capture, it noticed something. The biometric report filed by the Veth detention vessel was routine in format. The Veth filed routine reports with the Galactic accord the way that certain types of people file paperwork, not because they particularly respected the requirement, but because the consequences of not filing were more inconvenient than the filing itself. The report contained cell dimensions, prisoner count, atmospheric composition of the holding area, and a full biometric scan of each prisoner. It was a standard document. It arrived in the monitoring station's queue alongside thousands of other standard documents. The station read it in approximately 4 seconds. Then it read it again. It sent the file to 4 separate review queues simultaneously, which it had never done with a single document before. Each queue belonged to a different branch of the Accord's compliance division, and each branch had a different specialty. The flags the station attached to the document were not small. They were the kind of flags that caused consoles to emit sounds that had not been heard in those offices for a very long time. In the office of the Sorvani ambassadorial delegation, the sound woke Ambassador Crethale from what her species called a recovery rest, which was not exactly sleep, but was close enough that being pulled out of it abruptly had roughly the same effect on her that being shaken awake at 3 in the morning has on a human being. She sat upright in her chamber, registered the alert tone, and moved to her console at a pace that was unhurried only because Sorvani physiology did not permit rushing. Inside, she was already moving as fast as she could. The Sorvani were ancient. Not ancient the way a mountain is ancient, sitting there weathering things, but ancient the way a civilization can be ancient when it has had long enough to think carefully about every mistake it ever made and decide what to do differently. They had been members of the Galactic Accord for so long that some of their earliest delegates were listed in the Accord's foundational documents as authors. They had watched dozens of species reach the stars and make the errors that newly spacefaring species tend to make, errors of ambition and misunderstanding, and the assumption that the galaxy is simply a larger version of whatever planet you came from. The thing the Sorvani valued above almost everything else, the thing that had become central to their legal philosophy, their diplomatic practice, and their understanding of what it meant to be a civilized species, was the protection of what they called developmental stage sentience. The term referred to any member of any species who had not yet completed the biological and cognitive maturation process of their kind. The concept had emerged from a catastrophe in Sorvani history, so old that most other species only knew it as a reference in legal texts, a moment when their own young had been treated as collateral in a conflict between adults, and what that had cost them, and what they had sworn afterward. Crethale read the biometric report. She read it a second time, more slowly. The scans were unambiguous. Incomplete skeletal calcification across all 12 subjects. Prefrontal cortex structures in various stages of development, none of them complete. Neural architecture consistent with active pruning phases. Endocrine profiles showing the hormonal signatures of biological maturation in progress. These were not small beings who happened to be adults. These were organisms that were, by any biological measure, unfinished, in the process of becoming. Not yet what they were going to be. They were children. Crethale had been an ambassador for 31 years. She had negotiated trade disputes, territorial claims, resource conflicts, and 2 situations that had very nearly become wars. In all of that time, she had never activated the full-spectrum diplomatic emergency signal, which was reserved for situations of imminent or ongoing harm to protected classes of beings. She activated it now. The response was not slow. The Sorvani diplomatic staff arrived within minutes, some of them still pulling on outer garments, all of them looking at Crethale with expressions that asked the question before anyone spoke it. She showed them the scans without a preamble. She did not explain. She did not need to. The room went very quiet. One of her junior attaches, a young woman named Soli who had been with the delegation for only 8 months, looked at the biometric profiles on the screen and then looked at Crethale and said, in a voice that was barely above a murmur, "How old are they?" Crethale said, "The oldest is 16 years. The youngest is 11. Their species lives to approximately 80 years on average." Soli did the arithmetic without being asked. They are barely a fifth of the way through their lives. Some of them less than that, Crethale said. The emergency session of the Galactic Accord Council was called within the hour. This was itself extraordinary. Emergency sessions existed in the Accord's governance framework, but they were rarely convened because the process of convening one required a threshold of urgency that most situations, even serious ones, did not meet. The threshold had been met. It had been met with room to spare. The council chamber was a large circular room aboard the Accord's permanent station, a habitat that orbited a neutral point between four-star systems and served as the closest thing the Accord had to a capital. The chamber had seats arranged in a wide arc around a central floor space, and each delegation sat in their assigned position with their staff arrayed behind them. The chamber could hold representatives from all 31 current member species of the Accord. On this occasion, 28 of the 31 were present within 40 minutes, which was a logistical achievement of some significance given how far apart some of their habitats were. The Veth delegation arrived last. There were 3 of them. They walked in with the careful, considered movement that the Veth always used in formal settings, and they took their seats and arranged their documents and prepared themselves for what they assumed would be a standard session, perhaps an unusual one given the short notice, but standard in its structure and expectations. They were not prepared for what they found. The lead Accord archivist, a Sarathi drone designated Record 7, presented the case in the measured, precise way that Sarathi handled everything, which was to say without emotion, but with an absolute commitment to completeness. The biometric scans appeared on the large central display for every delegation to see. Record 7 walked through each measurement, each biological indicator, each developmental marker, and explained in careful terms what each one meant. As Record 7 spoke, Creethale watched the room. The DR Eval delegates, who were an amphibious species that raised their young in communal groups of sometimes hundreds of individuals, had gone very still in the early seconds of the presentation. Then, gradually, a sound began from their section of the chamber. It was low and rhythmic and resonant, and it moved between the 3 DR Eval present like a wave passing between them. Creethale had been in diplomatic settings with DR Eval often enough to know what that sound was. She had hoped she would never hear it outside of a DR Eval funeral gathering. It was the sound their species made when the young of any species were lost or harmed. It was not a sound they made by choice. It was not a sound they could stop. It came from somewhere much older than conscious decision. The Sarathi drones in the chamber, who were networked minds housed in mechanical forms and who generally did not engage in anything resembling emotional expression, began broadcasting a legal hold signal to the Veth detention vessel without waiting for authorization for the council chair. This was technically a procedural violation. Nobody in the room said anything about it. Nobody was going to. The Veth lead delegate, whose name translated roughly as Arbiter of Materials, had been sitting with the careful composure that Veth cultivated in formal settings. That composure was eroding. Creethale could see it happening, the subtle shifts in its posture, the slowing of its organ circulation visible through its translucent exterior, the way its upper limbs had drawn slightly closer to its body. When Record 7 finished the biometric presentation, the council chair, a Sorvani elder named Vinkarath who had held the position for 19 years, gave the floor to the Veth delegation. Arbiter of Materials stood. It said that the 12 prisoners had been captured in proximity to a planetary monitoring installation and had been assessed as members of an Earth military scout unit. It said that Earth's designation in the Accord's registry was listed under the category of pre-contact monitoring, meaning that no formal first contact had been established, and that interaction with Earth vessels or personnel was therefore technically unauthorized by default rather than by explicit prohibition. It said that the Veth had followed standard detention procedures for unauthorized personnel found in monitored space. It said that the detention had been conducted within acceptable parameters. There was a silence after this. Then Creethale spoke. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to raise her voice in 31 years of diplomacy, and she did not begin now. She said, "You have told us what procedures were followed. I am asking you something different. I am asking whether at any point in the process of capturing these 12 beings and placing them in a detention cell, anyone on your vessel asked how old they were." Arbiter of Materials was quiet for a moment. It said the biometric scan was conducted. The data was filed. Creethale said, "But did anyone look at it? Did anyone on your crew, in all the time since these children were taken, look at those numbers and ask what they meant?" The Veth delegate did not answer. Record 7 pulled up the next element of the presentation without being asked. The central display changed to show a curated selection of Earth's own public broadcast transmissions, which have been intercepted and cataloged as part of the standard monitoring process for pre-contact species. What appeared was not military communication or technical data. What appeared was a children's cartoon program, then a public service announcement about a pediatric healthcare initiative, then footage from what appeared to be a school, which showed many small human beings sitting at tables and drawing pictures and raising their hands to answer questions from a larger human being at the front of the room. Then Record 7 displayed the footage from inside the detention cell. Not all of it, a representative sample. It showed Darius doing card tricks. It showed Nina finishing her joke and the other children laughing. It showed Lily asking Owen a question about the food cubes and Owen answering her with what appeared to be complete seriousness, and then both of them being very quiet for a moment before Lily nodded and went back to eating. It showed at one point most of the 12 of them sitting in a rough circle on the floor, and the older boy, Owen, appearing to be teaching some kind of game that involved clapping and patterns, and the younger ones learning it and making mistakes and laughing at the mistakes and trying again. The DRA vol sound in the chamber grew slightly louder. Creethale let the footage run for another moment, then looked at the VETH delegation. She said, "I want to be fair to you. I understand that your species does not have a developmental phase. I understand that every VETH individual that has ever lived was born with full cognitive function and has never experienced being young in the way that many of the species in this chamber have experienced it. I understand that when you look at these scans and this footage, you may not immediately feel the weight of what you're seeing because you have no personal framework for it. I'm asking you to set that aside and simply look. Look at what these beings are. Look at how small the youngest one is. Look at what they're doing in that cell." She paused. "They are playing," she said. "They are teaching each other games to pass the time because they are frightened and because they are children and because playing is what children do when they are frightened and have nothing else. They are keeping each other company. They are managing their fear with the only tools available to them, which are each other and their own imagination. And they have been doing this for 9 days in a cell aboard your ship." The chamber was very still. Creethale said, "I'm not asking you whether you meant to do harm. I'm sure you did not think of it as harm. I'm telling you that what was done, whatever the intent, caused harm to beings who are under accord law and under the basic moral framework that every species in this chamber has ratified, among the most protected class of sentience that exists." She let the silence hold. Then she said, quietly, in a way that every delegate in the room heard clearly, "You imprisoned human children. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what you have done?" Arbiter of Materials stood very still. It did not answer. And in the chamber, in the section belonging to the Sorvani delegation, a young attaché named Soli, who had been in diplomatic service for 8 months and who had never before been moved by anything in a council session because she had always assumed that diplomacy was, at its core, a dry and procedural business, found that her eyes were wet. She had not expected that. She was not the only one. The session was not immediately adjourned. Council protocol required that after a statement of charges, the accused party be given time to prepare a formal response. An arbiter of materials was escorted to the VETH delegation's private conference room with 2 legal advisors and what appeared to be a great deal of uncertainty. The chamber shifted during that interval in the way chambers shift when something large has settled into the air and no one yet knows what to do with it. Creethale did not leave the floor. She stood at the center of the speaking area and allowed the delegates around her to speak to their own staffs, to consult their advisors, to absorb what they had seen. She watched the room. This was something she had learned very early in her diplomatic career, that the period after a significant statement is often more revealing than the statement itself. How a chamber behaved in the minutes after something important was said told you more about the real positions of its members than hours of prepared remarks. The DRA vol representative had been joined by her full delegation staff, who had come forward from their seats to stand around her in the way that DRA vol instinctively gathered when one of their number was distressed. They did not speak. They simply stood close. The keening sound had faded to something lower and more sustained, less a sound now than a vibration. The Sarathi drones had stopped broadcasting the legal hold signal and were now processing, which for Sarathi meant a rapid cycling of their visible processing lights and a complete absence of movement or communication. When Sarathi went still like that, it generally meant they were running analyses faster than they could simultaneously narrate, which was the Sarathi equivalent of someone being so busy with a thought that they forgot to speak. The smaller delegations, the species that tended to follow the currents of the larger powers rather than set their own course, were watching Kree Thale. This was not unusual. In a chamber like this one, the species with the most defined positions on a given issue tended to become the gravitational centers, and on the specific issue of developmental stage protection, there was no more defined position in the room than the Sorvani one. Aldrich appeared at Kree Thale's elbow and said, very quietly, "The Veth legal team has requested an extension of the preparation period." Kree Thale said, "How long?" He said, 3 standard days. She said 1. He nodded and went to communicate this. The Veth legal team, it turned out, needed less time than they had requested, which was not because they had found a strong argument, but because they had looked carefully at the arguments available to them and determined that the strong ones did not exist. What they had was the procedural defense, the argument that they had followed their own lawful process without malicious intent, and the ignorance defense, the argument that they could not be held fully accountable for a harm that arose from a gap in understanding rather than a deliberate choice. Both arguments were legally real. Both arguments had precedent. Neither argument was going to be comfortable to make in a room that had just watched footage of children playing card games in a detention cell. When Arbiter of Materials returned to the floor the following session, it made the arguments carefully and without elaboration, because elaboration would not have helped. It said that the Veth had acted within their own lawful framework. It said that the concept of developmental stage sentience was not a category recognized in Veth biological or legal science, because the Veth did not have such a stage and therefore had no domestic framework for identifying it in others. It said that the biometric data had been filed correctly and had not been assessed further because there was no flagging mechanism in Veth detention protocol for developmental indicators from non-Veth species. It said that the harm, while genuine and deeply regretted, had arisen from a failure of interspecies knowledge rather than from intent. The chamber listened. Record 7 then presented the counterargument, which was that the Accord's own shared biometric standards, which every member species, including the Veth, had ratified 30 years earlier, contained explicit markers for developmental stage identification across member and pre-member species, and that the Veth detention system was required under their Accord membership to cross-reference detainee scans against those shared standards. The failure to do so was not a gap in knowledge. It was a failure of implementation. The Veth legal team had no answer to this. They had read the same documents. They had seen it coming. What they said, in the end, was the only thing they had left, which was simply, "We did not know they were children. We know now. We are sorry." It was not enough legally. The legal proceedings would determine what enough looked like in more precise terms. But it was, in its way, a real thing. And Kree Thale, who had spent 31 years learning to tell the difference between a genuine acknowledgement and a diplomatic performance, believed it was real. She filed that belief privately. It did not change the charges, but it changed in some small way how she intended to carry the rest of the process, which was with firmness rather than anger, because those were different things and the difference mattered. Outside the chamber, in a corridor that looked out over the station's central habitat ring, Soli was standing with a cup of something warm and looking at the view. Aldrich found her there between sessions and stood beside her, and they were quiet for a moment. Soli said, "The oldest one is 16. Aldrich said, "Yes." She said, "When I was 16, I was in my second year of diplomatic school, and I thought I understood what the Accord was for." She paused. "I did not understand it the way I understand it right now." Aldrich did not say anything. Soli said, "Do you think they're all right?" "The children," Aldrich said. "From the footage, they appear to be managing remarkably well." Soli said, "That's what worries me a little. Children shouldn't have to manage remarkably well. They should just get to be children." Aldrich thought about that for a moment. He said, "That is, I think, exactly what Kree Thale said in her opening remarks to the council, stated in a rather more personal way. Soli nodded slowly. She drank from her cup. She looked at the stars visible through the outer hull. She said, I hope the VEF legal team understands that the argument they made today, the one about not knowing, I hope they understand that I did not know is only the beginning of an apology, not the whole of one. Aldrich said, I suspect they are beginning to. The session closed. The preparation for the next day began. Somewhere many thousands of kilometers away, aboard a ship that was now holding very still under the watch of 47 vessels, 12 human children were doing what they had been doing since the first day, which was keeping each other company and making noise and refusing, in every small way available to them, to become less than they were. The card that Darius had placed on top of the food slot on the 6th day was still there on the morning of the 7th. It was a 3 of clubs. He had balanced it with great care against the edge of the slot when the guard came on rotation, and either the guard had not noticed it or had noticed it and chosen to leave it, and Darius considered both options a victory. I watched him do it and asked him why. He said, I want to see if they take it. I said, and if they do? He said, then they're curious. And if they're curious, they're not just machines. That was Darius. He thought in angles. He was 14, and he thought in angles that most adults I have ever known would not have bothered to look for. On the morning of the 8th day, when the slot opened and 3 gray cubes came through, the 3 of clubs came back through too, balanced carefully on top of one of the cubes. Darius stared at it for a long time. Then he folded a small paper crane from the foil wrapper of one of the cubes and left it on the slot. He had taught himself origami from a library book 2 years earlier and had never found a particular use for the skill until that moment. The crane came back the next morning. Someone had placed it on top of the cubes with what looked like deliberate care. He made a paper frog the following day. That came back too. Then a paper boat. Then a small angular shape that was, if you looked at it from a certain direction, a fish. Each one came back. Each time the slot opened, there was a moment, a tiny pause before the cubes came through, as if whoever was on the other side was looking at whatever Darius had placed there the night before. We never talked about it in terms of strategy. We just watched it happen, and it changed something the way the temperature in a room changes when a window is opened. That was the thing about those days. Nothing we did was dramatic. Nothing we did required special training or extraordinary courage or some rare gift that ordinary children would not have. What we did was just very, very human. Pre-accounted things. When she had finished with the floor tiles, she counted the grill slits in the air vent, which were 42. She counted the intervals between guard rotations, which were irregular, but had a pattern that repeated every 3 cycles. She counted the number of seconds it took for the food slot to close after opening. She was not planning an escape. She simply needed to count things. She had always needed to count things. It calmed her. The data she gathered, which she reported to me in quiet sessions against the left wall, ended up being some of the most useful information we had. Lily discovered the translation module by accident. She had been humming to herself, which she did constantly and without noticing, and she passed close to the small rectangular device mounted at shoulder height near the door, which was the only thing in the room besides the slot and the vent that appeared to be a technological fixture. The device made a small sound when she passed it. She stopped. She hummed the same note again, closer. The device made the same small sound. She called me over. We spent an hour that afternoon testing it systematically. Lily would hum a note. The device would respond or not respond. Higher notes got no reaction. Lower notes got the small sound. Notes in a particular middle range caused the device to light up briefly along one edge. Lily began experimenting with intervals, with 2 notes together with patterns. By the end of the 2nd hour, she had found a sequence that caused the device to emit a completely different sound, something sharper and more complex that I had not heard it make before. On the 9th day, the interrogator came in for what had become its routine visit. I was standing, which I always try to be when it arrived. It asked me, through the translation device it carried, about Earth's capacity for interstellar communication. I said, "What do you know about music?" It was quiet. I said, "Sound arranged into patterns. It is one of the most important things human beings do. We have been doing it for as long as we can remember." It said, "This is relevant to my inquiry?" I said, Every piece of technology your species has ever made came out of a brain that was also capable of music. I think that is relevant to everything. It stood still for a long time. Then it said, in its layered tones, something that the device translated as, "You are not what our models predicted." I said, "No, we probably aren't." It said, "What are you?" I said, "We are children. I keep telling you that." It left. That evening, Ben sat beside me against the right wall, which had become a kind of informal talking spot for the two of us. And he said, "Do you actually know what's happening out there?" I said, "No." He said, "Do you think anyone is looking for us?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "I don't know. I just think yes is the better thing to say." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough." The cell had begun to feel, in some strange way, like a space we owned. That sounds wrong. We did not own it. We had not chosen it. We wanted to leave it very badly. But 12 people in a room for 9 days will make it theirs in small ways without deciding to. Cleo's notebook lived in a particular corner. Priya's counting spot was the rear left area. Darius's origami workspace was near the slot. The younger children had claimed a patch near the center where they played whatever game they happened to be inventing that day. And the games changed daily and had elaborate rules that they argued about with complete seriousness. On the morning of the 10th day, the door opened at a time that was not a scheduled rotation. A being stood in the doorway. It was not the interrogator. This one was different, shorter, with different markings around its head, and it held nothing in its hands. It stood in the doorway and looked at us, and we looked at it, and nobody moved for a moment. Then it spoke without using a translation device, which meant I could not understand a word. But it looked directly at me, and it spoke for several seconds, and then it stopped. And then it said one word in English that the translation device it wore on its body produced. The word was stop. I said, "What should we stop?" The device translated my question. The being answered. The device said, "Everything. All of it. We do not understand what you are." I looked at it for a moment. I said, "We are children. We are a student from a school on a planet called Earth. We were on a trip to a radio telescope field. We have been here for 10 days. We would like to go home." The being looked at me for a long time. I said, "Can we go home?" It did not answer that question. It stood for another moment, then turned and left, and the door closed, and all 12 of us were left standing in the middle of the cell looking at the door. Nina said, "Honestly, as conversations go, I've had worse." Finn, who almost never spoke, said, "Something is changing." We all turned to look at him. He said, "The guard rotation changed 2 cycles ago. The interval is shorter. That usually means a system shift. When systems shift, something is about to happen." I asked him how long he had been tracking the guard rotation. He said, "Since day 3. I looked at Priya. She nodded. She had independently reached the same conclusion. I said, "All right, then we wait." And that is what we did. We sat down on the humming metal floor, and Darius dealt out cards for a game that did not need all 4 suits. And Lily started humming something that was not quite a song yet. And Cleo wrote in her notebook, and I sat with my back against the wall and thought about nothing in particular, which I'd gotten surprisingly good at. Outside the walls of that cell, things were happening that I did not yet know about. There were arguments being made on our behalf by beings who had never met us. There were legal precedents being assembled. There were species who had never agreed on anything agreeing loudly and with great feeling on this. There were 47 ships being directed toward our location by an entity named Crethale, who I had never heard of and who had spent the previous 36 hours doing things on our behalf that I could not have imagined. We did not know any of that. Cleo read me something from her notebook on the evening of the 9th day. She had been writing in it steadily since the first hour, filling pages in the small, neat handwriting she always used, the kind of handwriting that looked like it had been made by someone who had decided very early that if you're going to put something down, it should at least be legible. She said she wanted to read me something, not because it was important, but because she had been keeping it to herself for too long, and she thought saying it out loud might make it feel more real. She read, "We are doing all right. This is the strangest place I have ever been, and I did not choose to come here, and I would like to leave. But when I look around at everyone, I can see that we are doing all right. I don't know how. I think maybe it's because none of us has decided yet that we can't." She closed the notebook. I said, "That's true." She said, "I know. I just wanted to hear someone else say it." Ben had developed what he called the argument system, which was exactly what it sounded like. Any two people who needed to stop thinking about where they were could pick a topic and argue about it. And the topic did not need to be important, and in fact, the less important, the better. He and George had spent 45 minutes on the seventh day arguing about whether a hot dog was a sandwich. They both argued with complete seriousness, and neither conceded anything, and by the end of it, the whole cell had taken sides, and it was the most awake we had all felt at the same time. I did not tell them this was a good strategy. I did not want it to become something deliberate, because deliberate things lose the quality that makes them work. On the evening of the eighth day, George asked me quietly, away from the others, if I thought there was a chance we would not get home. I looked at him. He had wrapped his hand well on the first day, and the cut had been healing cleanly for a week. He was a steady person, George. He did not ask unnecessary questions. If he was asking this one, he had earned it. I said, "I think the chance is small. I think we're useful to them as long as they believe we know things they want to know. And as long as we are useful, they will not want to remove us." He said, "And when they decide we don't know anything useful?" I said, "By then, something will have changed. I don't know what, but 10 days is not a long time for something to change." He thought about that. He said, "Okay." He went back to the others. He did not mention it again, not to me, not as far as I know to anyone else. He carried it the way he had carried the cut on his hand, quietly and without making it anyone else's problem. I think about George's question more than I think about most things from those days. Not because it frightened me, though it did, but because of how he asked it. He asked it the way someone asks a question when they have already made a private decision about the answer and are simply checking whether the person they trust most agrees. He had already decided we were going to be fine. He just wanted me to confirm it. I have found, in the years since, that this is something humans do more than most species seem to. We decide things emotionally first, and then look for the logic to support the decision. And when the logic holds up, we feel better, and when it doesn't, we find a way to hold both the fear and the hope in the same hand and keep moving. Other species find this baffling. The Sorvani find it almost beautiful, which is high praise from a species that has been around long enough to have very specific opinions about what beauty is. The nights, which are not nights, but were the periods when the cell light dimmed slightly and most of us slept, were the hardest. During the days, there was always something to do, some small task or conversation or game to anchor to. In the dimness, when the others were sleeping and I was not, which happened more often as the days went on, there was nothing but the hum and the blue light and my own thoughts. I thought about my parents. I thought about the specific way my mother said my name when she was looking for me somewhere in the house, not calling out, just saying it once as if she believed I would materialize. I thought about my father's habit of leaving his coat on the back of every chair he sat in, so that in any room he had occupied for more than 10 minutes, there was always a coat on a chair back, and you always knew he had been there. I thought about these things the way you think about them when you're not sure when you will see them again, which is very carefully and with a great deal of attention to detail. I thought about what I would tell people when we got home. I had already started to understand, somewhere around day 7, that we were going to get home, though I could not have explained why I was sure. It was not logic. It was something quieter than logic, something closer to the way Cleo had said we were doing all right, a settling of the question that did not require evidence. I also thought in those quiet, dim periods about what was outside the walls. I had no information. I had the sounds of the ship and Priya's data and the small shifting things in the behavior of the guards. But I found myself thinking not about the structure of the ship or the number of beings on it or any of the practical things I had been cataloging. I found myself thinking about how big the space was that we were moving through, the sheer scale of it, the fact that we were inside a metal room, inside a metal ship, inside a volume of space that contained more than I could form a picture of. And rather than making me feel small, which I had expected, it made me feel curious. I remember noticing that. I remember noticing that the biggest feeling I had in the dark quiet of those nights was not fear, but a kind of burning, pressing curiosity about everything outside those walls. I wanted to know what the stars looked like from out here. I wanted to know what the ship looked like from outside. I want to know where we were going and who had built the ship and how long the beings on board had been traveling and whether they had music and what their music sounded like. I cannot do anything with any of that curiosity. I was in a cell, but I held it the way I held everything else in those days, carefully and with attention because it was mine. We just waited, the way you wait when you're 16 and the world has put you somewhere strange, which is to say with as much patience as you can manage and a little more noise than is probably necessary. That was fine. We had enough noise. The ships arrived over 3 consecutive hours, and they did not come quietly. The first thing I knew about it was a change in the vibration. The floor of the cell had hummed at a particular frequency for 10 days without variation, the same low constant murmur that I had stopped consciously hearing around day 3 the way you stop hearing a refrigerator. On the morning of the 11th day, that frequency changed. It changed twice in quick succession, each time shifting to something slightly higher and slightly less even, more like a tremor than a hum. Finn noticed first. He looked up from the card game and put his hand flat on the floor and said, "Engines." I pressed my hand down too. He was right. The vibration had a different quality now, something reactive rather than constant, the kind of movement that comes from a system responding to something rather than simply running. Priya said, "External signal. The guard rotation stopped 4 minutes ago. Complete stop. No cycle." I stood up. Ben said, "What does that mean?" I said, "I think it means we have company." We did not know in those minutes what was outside the ship. We could not see it. There were no windows, no screens, no way to observe anything beyond the walls of that cell. But the ship was telling us things whether it meant to or not, through its sounds and its tremors and the complete sudden absence of the guard rotation that Priya had been tracking for a week. The 47 ships that the Galactic Accord had dispatched arrived in formation, which was itself a message. They did not position themselves for conflict. They positioned themselves in a wide arc around the Veth detention vessel, which placed them at equal distances and equal angles from every approach, which in Accord diplomatic protocol is a configuration known as full witness. It means every ship can see everything. It means nothing that happens here is private. It means whatever occurs in this space will be seen by all parties simultaneously and recorded by all parties simultaneously, and that there is no possible account of events afterward that can contradict any other account. The Veth crew aboard the detention vessel understood what full witness meant. Their captain filed 4 separate requests for clarification in the first 20 minutes after the formation was complete. None of those requests received an answer, which was also part of the protocol. Full witness does not negotiate. It simply watches. Ambassador Kree Thale was aboard the lead Sorvani vessel, which was the largest ship in the formation and which sat at the center of the arc like the fulcrum of a scale. She had been awake for 31 hours. She had not felt the weight of those hours because the situation had not permitted her to. She was standing at the primary observation point of her vessel, looking at the Veth ship, which was a compact and angular vessel that seemed, from outside, to have no particular quality that would suggest it contained anything remarkable. She knew what it contained. Her deputy, a calm and thorough man named Aldrich who had been with the Sorvani Diplomatic Corps for 12 years, came to stand beside her and said, "The Veth captain has acknowledged our full witness signal." Kree Thale said, and Aldrich said, "They are requesting that the formation stand down. They say the detention is a lawful security measure under their own domestic jurisdiction." Kree Thale said, "The prisoners are not from their domestic jurisdiction. They are pre-contact humans, which places them under Accord protection by default. That argument has no foundation." Aldrich said, "I have communicated that. The captain has asked to speak with you directly." Kree Thale considered it. She said, "Put them through." The Veth captain appeared on screen. It was a senior individual, older in the way that Veth showed age, which was a deepening of the structures visible inside their translucent forms rather than any surface change. It spoke with the kind of composure that comes from long training rather than genuine calm. It said, "Ambassador Kree Thale, this formation is unnecessary. The situation is under control." Kree Thale said, "Describe for me what you mean by under control." The captain said, "The The prisoners are detained safely. They are fed. They have not been harmed. Crethale said, they have been confined to a cell for 11 days. They are children. The captain said, that designation is contested. Our biometric assessment classified them as adult scouts. Crethale said, I have the biometric data from your own vessel scan. I have shown that data to the full Accord Council. No member of that council, including the 3 Veth Council representatives, contested the interpretation of those scans. The beings on your ship are developmental stage sentients by every biological and legal standard the Accord recognizes. The captain was quiet. Crethale said, I'm going to come aboard your vessel. I am going to do this under full witness and under the emergency humanitarian provisions of Article 19 of the Accord Charter. I am asking you to receive me peaceably. The captain said, and if I decline? Crethale said quietly, then 47 ships will be watching you decline, and the record of that decision will be filed with every member species in the Accord, and we will proceed under Article 22 instead, which does not require your permission. There was a silence. The captain said, you may come aboard. The shuttle from Crethale's vessel docked with the Veth ship 12 minutes later. She came with a small team, 6 individuals, all of them senior diplomatic staff, and all of them carrying the kind of quiet professionalism that comes from having done difficult things in difficult places many times before. Aldrich was with her. 2 Sarathi legal drones, who would serve as independent witnesses, completed the group. The Veth captain received them in the ship's main corridor. The meeting was formal and brief. Crethale did not waste time on pleasantries or extensive preliminary discussion. She said she wished to see the detention area. The captain took her there. The corridor outside the cell was narrow and lit in the same pale blue as the cell interior. There was a guard station with 2 Veth officers, both of whom stood back as the captain approached. On a small shelf beside the guard station, there was, inexplicably, a small paper frog. Crethale looked at it. The Veth officer closest to her said, through the translation relay that had been set up for the visit, one of the prisoners makes them. They come through the food slot each morning. We return them. Crethale looked at the frog for a long moment. She picked it up carefully. She turned it over once. She sat back down. She said, open the door. The door opened. I was standing in the middle of the cell when it happened. I had made a habit of standing when the door opened because I had decided early on that I would always be on my feet when I faced whatever came through. It had become a reflex. The door opened and I was standing and I looked at what came through, and it was not the interrogator, and it was not the being who had said stop, and it was not any Veth individual I had seen before. She was tall by human standards, though not as tall as the Veth, and her form was roughly bipedal, but with proportions that were not quite human. Her limbs slightly longer, her head slightly broader at the back, her skin a pale grayish blue that I would later learn was entirely normal for her species. She wore clothing that was formal and structured. She moved into the room, and she looked at me, and the expression on her face was not the clinical assessment I had seen from the Veth, and it was not the blank surveillance I had experienced since the first day. She looked at me the way my grandmother looks at me when I've been ill and have recovered, and she can see that I'm all right, but she needs a moment before she can speak. I found, to my great embarrassment, that my eyes had gone wet. I had been holding things together for 11 days. I had been the oldest, and I had been the one who stood up, and I had been feeding the younger ones reasonable explanations and manageable portions of the truth this whole time. And I had done it because someone had to, and it had not been especially difficult because I had been too busy to stop and feel anything in particular. I stopped now. She stood and waited. She did not say anything. She did not try to fix it or redirect it or explain it away. She simply let it be what it was, and I pulled myself together after a moment. And she still had not moved or spoken, and I thought that was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had done for me in 11 days. I said, my name is Owen. She said, in English that was careful and slightly formal, but entirely clear, my name is Crethale. I am sorry. I am sorry it took this long. I am sorry you were here. Behind me, Lily said, very quietly, are we going home? Crethale looked past me to where Lily was standing in her yellow raincoat, which was slightly worse for 11 days of wear, but still entirely yellow. She said, Yes. You're going home. The legal proceedings against the Veth began that same day aboard the Accord flagship, which was positioned at the center of the formation and served as neutral judicial ground. Cree Thale did not attend the opening session because she was with us, which was where she had decided to be, and Aldrich represented the Sorvani delegation in the chamber, while she sat in a larger, better-lit room aboard the flagship and supervised a medical evaluation of 12 humans who had not been outside a metal cell in 11 days. The charges were read by Record 7 in the precise, unadorned way that Sarathi handled all official proceedings. The first charge was unlawful detention of developmental stage sentients under Article 19. The second was psychological endangerment of pre-adult minds under the supplemental provisions of the Accord's Sentient Welfare Compact. The third charge was the one that made the room very still because it was the largest. The third charge was violation of a non-interference protocol for emerging species. Earth was not supposed to know about the Accord. Earth was on a long list of species that had been assessed as not yet ready for first contact, a list that existed because the Accord had, across its long history, learned that premature contact with an emerging species caused disruptions that were very difficult to undo. Earth had been on that list for 40 years. The plan, such as it was, had been to continue monitoring and to initiate formal contact within the next 2 to 3 decades, when Earth's own trajectory suggested a greater readiness. The Veth had reached into a field outside Dunmore and pulled 12 children out of it, and in doing so had ended 40 years of careful planning in a single moment. The entire protocol, the timeline, the approach strategy, the communications framework that had been in development for 11 years, all of it was now irrelevant. Earth knew something was out there. 12 humans who had been in a Veth cell for 11 days were sitting in a medical room aboard an Accord flagship, and they were going to go home, and they were going to talk because, of course, they were going to talk. They were human beings. Talking was what they did. The Veth delegate at the hearing attempted to argue that the damage was limited and could be managed. Several council members disagreed with considerable feeling. The DRA Vol representative made a speech that lasted 12 minutes and was largely composed of things that were not legally relevant, but were delivered with such genuine distress that nobody interrupted her. The Sarathi drones broadcast a continuous legal hold signal on all Veth frequencies for the duration of the session, which is also technically not required at this stage, but which nobody moved to stop. The verdict came in 4 hours, which was the fastest the council had ever ruled on a case of this magnitude. The Veth were required to issue a formal apology to each of the 12 human children individually, in writing, translated into English, and to file that apology with the Accord's permanent record. They were required to pay significant reparations, the specifics of which were determined by a separate subcommittee and which I will not go into detail about here, except to say that they were not small. They were required to undertake a full review of their detention protocols and to submit that review to the Accord within 1 standard year. And then there was the fourth outcome, which was the one nobody had planned for and which came not from any legal process, but from a proposal that Cree Thale put before the council on the evening of the second day after a rescue. She said that Earth could no longer be treated as a pre-contact species. The contact had already happened. It had not been authorized or planned or conducted with any of the care that the Accord's protocols required. But it had happened, and there was no version of reality in which 12 human children went home and did not tell the story of where they had been. She said that the question before the council was not whether to make contact with Earth, but how to respond to the contact that had already been made. She proposed immediate formal first contact, conducted properly, with full Accord representation and a transparent account of what had occurred and why. She said that beginning the relationship with honesty rather than damage control was not simply the ethical choice. She said it was the only practical one. She said that humanity would be a member of this community eventually, and that the first thing they learned about the Accord should not be that the Accord had tried to hide what had happened to their children. The council voted. The measure passed. And somewhere in a medical room on an Accord flagship, I was eating actual food for the first time in 11 days and arguing with Ben about whether the ship's medical lighting made everyone look slightly green, and I had no idea that the decision had been made, the decision that would change everything The decision that came out of the thing the vet had done wrong and the thing 12 children had, without any plan at all, managed to do right. The medical room was large and clean and smelled of something that was not quite antiseptic, but was close to it. And the food that the Accord staff provided was real food, or at least food that had been designed to match human nutritional requirements, which was not exactly the same as food from home, but was so dramatically different from gray cubes that none of us had any complaints. Ben ate 4 servings of something that looked like a grain dish with vegetables and declared it the greatest meal of his life. Lily disagreed and said she had once had a birthday dinner at a restaurant with a glass ceiling and that nothing could compete with that. This became an argument that lasted 20 minutes and involved most of the others taking sides, and it was exactly the kind of argument that had kept us sane for 11 days, and it was still working. Crethale stayed nearby throughout. She did not hover. She did not pepper us with questions or rush us through the medical process. She made herself available and otherwise allowed her staff to manage the practical elements, while she simply remained present in the way that someone remains present when they have decided their job in this moment is not to direct anything, but to be there. At some point in the middle of the evening, she and I ended up sitting across from each other at a small table near the window while the others were being seen to in the adjacent rooms. She had brought 2 cups of something that was warm and faintly sweet, and she set one in front of me without asking, and I took it without overthinking it. She said, "How are you?" I said, "Better than I was this morning." She said, "That is a careful answer." I said, "I'm a careful person." She considered that. She said, "You did not seem careful in the recordings. You seemed deliberate. There is a difference." I asked her what she meant. She said, "A careful person tries not to make mistakes. A deliberate person has decided what they're trying to do and does it on purpose. And if they make a mistake along the way, they correct it and continue. You were not trying to avoid mistakes. You were trying to get everyone through. Those are different goals." I thought about that. I said, "I made a lot of mistakes." She said, "I know. I watched 11 days of recordings." I said, "And?" She said, "And you corrected them and continued." There was a comfortable quiet between us for a moment. Outside the window, the formation of ships was still holding its arc, which looked from this angle like a wide crescent of light against the dark. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I had not yet had time to fully absorb that I was looking at it through a window on an alien flagship rather than through a photograph in a book. I said, "What happens now?" She said, "The formal proceedings will conclude in the next day or 2. After that, arrangements will be made to return you and your classmates to Earth. There are things that will need to be explained to your governments. There are processes." She paused. "There is quite a lot to untangle." I said, "You proposed first contact." She looked at me. She said, "How do you know that?" I said, "Aldrich was talking to someone near the room I was in." I was not trying to listen, but I was 16 days into paying very close attention to everything around me, and the habit had not turned off yet. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I proposed it." I said, "Is that strange? To make a decision like that, because of something like this?" She said, "The greatest decisions are usually made because of something specific rather than something abstract. Abstract decisions get debated endlessly. Specific ones get made." I looked at her. I said, "We did not do anything special. I need you to understand that. We did not do anything that required special training or special ability. We just did what was in front of us." She said, "I know." I said, "Then why does it feel like everyone is treating it as if we did something remarkable?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because what you did is remarkable to everyone who watched it, even if it did not feel remarkable to you. That is often how remarkable things work. The person doing them is too busy doing them to know." I thought about Lily asking about the food cubes. I thought about Darius and the 3 of clubs. I thought about Finn tracking the guard rotation in silence for 7 days. I thought about George wrapping his own hand. I said, "We were just busy." She said, "Yes, you were." She picked up her cup. That was the remarkable part. Across the room, Nina had apparently told the medical attendant who was recording her vital signs the same joke she had finished on the first day in the cell. I could tell because the attendant, whose species I had not yet identified, had gone very still in the particular way that beings go still when they have encountered something they do not know how to classify. Nina, apparently, was explaining it. She was using hand gestures. Ben said, from somewhere nearby, she's going to try to explain the concept of a punchline to an alien medical professional. I said, how long do you give her? He said, honestly, I think she lands it in under 5 minutes. He was right. She did. I am 23 years old, and I have been asked to write this account 3 times by 3 different people for 3 different purposes, and each time I've started in a slightly different place and ended in a slightly different place. But the middle has always been the same because the middle actually happened and does not change. What I remember most clearly about the first weeks after we came home is not the reunion, though that was significant, or the medical evaluations, which were thorough, or the interviews, which were many. What I remember most clearly is sitting in my bedroom on the first night back, in the dark, listening to the specific silence of a house at night, the settling of wood, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant sound of a car on the street, and thinking that I had never in my life understood how beautiful ordinary sounds were. Darius went on to study xenobiology. He is, at 22, already publishing work that 3 separate species have found interesting enough to translate. He still folds things from foil wrappers. He says he cannot help it. Lily is 15 now. She is studying linguistics and acoustic signal theory. She has not yet told her school counselor that the reason she finds tonal pattern recognition so natural is that she cracked open a communication channel on an alien ship when she was 11 by humming at a wall. She says she is saving that for when it will have the maximum effect. Nina teaches drama at a community center on weekends and is studying law on weekdays. She says she chose law because it turned out to be the thing that saved us more than anything else, and she wanted to understand how it worked. She finished her joke, by the way, the one she had been in the middle of when the light came. She told it to Cree Thale on the second day aboard the flagship. Cree Thale laughed, which was not something Servani did loudly or often, but she laughed. Priya works in data systems. She is very good at it. She has never stopped counting things. Fini stonding astrofizic. He barely speaks in social settings, which has not changed, but he presents research at conferences with a clarity that people describe as remarkable. He tracked the guard rotation for a week in silence and told me about it in 1 sentence. He is exactly who he was always going to be. George, whose hand had healed cleanly by the time we came home, is studying medicine. He wrapped his own injury without being asked. It is not surprising that he ended up going in that direction. Cleo's notebook from his cell is in a research archive now. She asked that it be preserved rather than treated as a personal document because she said the things she had written in it were not private thoughts but observations, and observations should be available. She is studying anthropology. She says it was an easy choice. Ben is exactly where you would expect him to be, which is in a career that involves talking. He is in communications. He is very loud about things he believes in. He is very good at his job. Abby stayed close to Lily for 2 years after we came home, and then gradually, in the natural way of things, moved into her own path, which turned out to be ecology. She has a particular interest in how ecosystems recover from disruption. Her advisors say it is a rich metaphor that runs through all her work. She doesn't call it a metaphor. Kara studied marine biology, as she had always intended. She published a paper last year on deep-sea communication patterns that had a footnote citing her time in the cell as the source of her initial interest in how beings communicate in environments without light or conventional signals. The footnote caused more attention than the paper itself for a while. And me, I am the youngest person to hold a seat at the human liaison desk of the Galactic Accord. The desk was created specifically because of what happened to us, because the Accord determined that Earth needed not just formal representation, but a dedicated channel that acknowledged the particular and unplanned way in which first contact had occurred. I was offered the position 2 years ago, and I took it without a great deal of deliberation because it seemed obvious, and obvious things do not require a great deal of deliberation. Cree Thale is still the Sorvani ambassador. We see each other regularly. She asked me, not long after I took the position, whether I had forgiven the Veth. I thought about it honestly, which was the only way I knew how to think about things anymore. I said that I did not know if forgiveness was the right word for what I felt about them. I said that what the Veth had done came from a kind of blindness more than a kind of cruelty, and that blindness was something I understood because I had spent 11 days in a room with 12 people and had seen how differently we each perceive the same experience. I said that the Veth legal scholar who had contacted me after the verdict to say that she had spent 6 minutes watching footage of a human kindergarten before she could form words had seemed genuinely broken open by it, and that being genuinely broken open by something is, I thought, the beginning of a different kind of understanding. I said that I still ate gray cubes sometimes, the flavored protein supplement variety that you can get at most nutrition shops, because they reminded me of the cell in a way that was not comfortable, but that I had decided was necessary because I did not want to stop being the person who had been in that room. That person was careful and counted things and thought in angles and found ways to laugh. I wanted to keep being her. Creethale said that was a very human answer. I said that was probably because I was very human. The Veth technician who filed 7 incident reports about us has been writing to me for 8 months. Her reports, when I finally read them in full as part of the case record, were extraordinary documents, careful and confused, and filled with the kind of observations that come from someone who is watching something they do not have a category for and knows it. She had written, in the 6th report, the following: prisoner emotional state continues to register as non-distressed despite confinement conditions. Instruments may be faulty. Recommend recalibration. Alternatively, recommend new instruments. She had not meant it as a joke. But I found it deeply funny, and when I wrote to tell her so, she had been very still for a moment in her response before writing back to say that she now understood what I meant by that. We write letters about what it means to grow, about what it means to be unfinished, about the long, strange gap between what a being is and what a being is becoming, and what lives in that gap, which is for humans quite a lot. She finds this fascinating. I find it useful to explain, because explaining things you have always known forces you to actually understand them instead of just assuming you do. The galaxy, it turned out, was full of species who had completed themselves a very long time ago, who had moved through their developmental phase so far back in their history that it had become, at most, a theoretical concept. They knew intellectually that their young had once been young. They had records of it. But the living experience of incompleteness, the moment-to-moment reality of being a mind that is still being built, was something they had finished with so long ago that they had, in various ways and to various degrees, forgotten what it was like. What they had forgotten, among other things, was that being unfinished is not a weakness. An unfinished mind is a flexible one. A being who is still becoming is a being who is still capable of becoming something different than they were yesterday. And this is when you meet the rest of the universe and discover how vast and strange it is, an extraordinary advantage. Humanity arrived at the galactic table not having solved everything, not having settled into final forms, not having answered all the questions we had about ourselves. We arrived still asking, still changing, still in the middle of the long argument about who we were and who we wanted to be. That, apparently, was notable, not because it made us powerful in the ways that power is usually measured, not because it made us better than species who had solved what we were still working on, but because the galaxy had not seen it in a while. That particular quality, the ability to be afraid and still curious, to be confined and still playful, to be small and still stubborn, to be in the middle of everything and still find things to laugh about. There was a moment on the flagship, on the second day after Creethale came aboard, when she brought us all into a large observation room that had a wide curved window looking out at the formation of 47 ships and the stars beyond them. We stood there for a while, 12 children of various sizes in clothes that had not been washed for 11 days, and nobody said anything for a long time because there was nothing to say. It was just the biggest thing any of us had ever seen, and we stood in front of it and let it be big. Then Lily, who was 11 and still wearing her yellow raincoat, pressed her hand against the glass and said, "I can't believe it. We're actually out here. Not we were taken. Not we survived. Not look what happened to us. We're actually out here. That is the thing I keep coming back to. That is the sentence that I think, more than any legal ruling or diplomatic outcome or historical record, captures what actually happened. 12 children got picked up from a field outside Dunmore and put in a cell on an alien ship, and what happened inside them. Over 11 days on a humming metal floor with nothing to work with but each other and some card tricks and a lot of foil wrappers was not a breaking. It was a noticing. They noticed where they were. They paid attention. They kept each other company. They sang at walls on the off chance that something would respond. Something always responds. The Accord has, in the years since, developed a formal protocol for early contact with pre-contact species that incorporates what are now known informally as the Dunmore Principles. I had nothing to do with drafting them, which is probably for the best, but I was asked to read the draft and give my response. And when I read the first principle, which states that any species capable of play, humor, and mutual comfort under conditions of high stress should be assessed as possessing a high degree of social and cognitive resilience regardless of their technological development, I sat with it for a moment and thought about Darius putting a 3 of clubs on a food slot to see what would happen. I think he would like knowing that is now an Accord principle. I have been asked many times what the right word is for what we did, whether it was brave or clever or lucky or some combination of all three. I never have a clean answer because the honest answer is that it was none of those things in the way they usually mean. We were scared. We were tired. We were making things up as we went, the way you always or when nothing has prepared you for what you are in the middle of. We did the things that came naturally because they were the only things available, and the things that came naturally turn out to be enough, and then more than enough, and then, in ways none of us predicted, world-changing. I want to tell you about the first time I attended a full Accord Council session as a representative. I was 21. The session was not about anything particularly urgent by Accord standards, a resource-sharing proposal between 3 mid-tier member species that had been in slow negotiation for 2 years. It was a routine matter. Aldrich had told me beforehand that it would be a useful introduction to the pace of formal sessions, which was often slower than people expected, because the Accord had long since learned that fast decisions in large rooms were rarely good ones. I sat in the seat that had been designated for the human liaison observer. It was in the outer arc, where observer class representatives sat rather than full member representatives, which was appropriate because Earth had only initiated formal contact processes and had not yet completed membership assessment. The chair was a standard Accord issue seat that had been modified for human dimensions, which meant someone had thought about how tall I was and adjusted accordingly, and I found that detail more moving than I expected to. The session opened. The council chair called the room to order. Record 7 began presenting the summary of the pending proposal. And I sat in that room, and I looked at the arc of delegates around me, beings from 31 species, and I thought about a cell with pale blue walls and a humming floor, and I thought about how Lily had pressed her hand to a ship window and said, "We're actually out here," and I thought that she was right, we were actually out here, and now so was I. And the distance between those two moments was 5 years, and also something that did not have a clean measurement. After the session, Crethale found me in the corridor. She said, "How is it?" I said, "Slower than I expected." She said, "It always is." I said, "Aldrich told me that." She said, "Aldrich is wise. You should listen to him more often." I said, "I do listen to him. I just also think things through myself, which sometimes takes a while." She said, "That is the most human thing you have ever said to me." We walked together for a while through the station's main habitat corridor, which was a long arch space with light that shifted slowly across the spectrum in cycles designed to accommodate multiple species' biological needs simultaneously, so that at any given moment the light was somewhat pleasant for everyone and perfect for no one, which was, I had come to understand, a reasonable description of how the Accord itself worked. I told her that I had spoken to the Veth technician the week before, the one who had filed the 7 incident reports. Her name, in a form that the translation software could render in English phonemes, was something close to Seveth, and she had been sending me letters for several months by then, careful and precise letters that asked genuine questions and waited patiently for genuine answers. She had asked me, in her most recent letter, what I found most difficult about the experience in the cell. Not the fear, she specified, she understood about fear, not the physical discomfort. She wanted to know what was hardest in a way that she suspected was specific to being a developmental stage sentient rather than an adult. I had thought about it for 2 days before answering. What I had written back was this. The hardest thing was not knowing whether the people I was trying to protect could tell I was also frightened. Because I was the oldest, and I had stood up and taken on the role of the one who had things under control, and had tried very hard to maintain that. But I was 16, and I was frightened, and I did not know if that was visible. And I spent quite a lot of energy worrying about it when I could have spent that energy on other things. She had written back within a day, which for Veth was very fast. She had written that she had read my response 3 times. She had written that she had access to all the behavioral footage from our cell, which she had watched originally as part of her monitoring duties and had since watched again, and that she could tell me with certainty that it had been visible. That every one of the younger children at various points had clearly been aware that I was frightened and had, in various ways, been trying to make me feel less so. She wrote that this was the part she found most extraordinary. Not that I had hidden my fear. Not that I had projected confidence, but that the others had seen through it and responded to it with care rather than panic, which she said she had no framework for it all, because in Veth experience, a leader who showed uncertainty was a leader whose unit destabilized. She had never encountered a situation in which the visible fear of the person in charge caused the people around them to become more supportive rather than less stable. I had not known that. That Darius dealing cards and Nina finishing her joke and Lily asking practical questions had, at least in part, been aimed at me. That the noisiness and the arguing and the games had not just been the children managing their own fear, but had also, in some way that none of us articulated, been the group managing mine. I told Cree Thale this in the corridor, and she listened without interrupting, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment. She said, "That does not surprise me." I said, "It surprised me." She said, "Children understand more than adults give them credit for. They simply do not always have the vocabulary to name what they understand." I said, "We didn't need the vocabulary. We just needed each other." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "That is going in the record, if you permit it." I said, "Which record?" She said, "The Accord's Cultural Archive. We have been adding to the human file since your return. Your account of the experience, your reflections, the footage, Sevith's incident reports, all of it. It will be part of how the Accord understands humanity for a very long time." I thought about Cleo's notebook sitting in an archive. I thought about Priya's counts, which I had written down and which were also, apparently, now part of a galactic record. I thought about Darius's paper frog, which was sitting in a display case in the Accord's cultural preservation section, because Cree Thale had personally requested that it be preserved and someone had agreed, and now a piece of foil folded by a 14-year-old boy was a historical artifact. I said, "You can use whatever is useful." She said, "All of it is useful." That is what I keep trying to explain to my colleagues when they ask which parts matter most. Humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Accord was not a diplomat or a general or a scientist. He was a 16-year-old boy from a school near Dunmore who stood up in a cell because someone had to, and who answered questions with questions, and who told an alien interrogator about music when it asked about military capacity, because it seemed like the most true and useful thing he could think to say. I do not know if that is inspiring. I suspect it is mostly just human. But I have come to think that those two things might be, more than we realize, the same. The Accord is enormous and old and full of species who have done extraordinary things across time spans that make human history look like an afternoon. And somewhere in all of that, 12 children in a metal box held each other together with card tricks and counting and paper animals and laughter. And the Accord looked at that and did not know what category to put in. And that confusion, that total inability to classify what we were, turned out to be the most powerful thing we had. We were not finished. We were still becoming. That changes everything. It always has.